What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast. As you can tell, it's not Lucas, it's Ty again, flying solo on another Wednesday episode where we are previewing the week's slate of games. And like I said, it's just me tonight. Cam's feeling under the weather a little bit, and Lucas isn't available, so you get me tonight. So, let's just plug the handles right away. Where you can find the fellas, where you can find me, where you can find Cam and Lucas. You can find us over on Twitter. Here are the personals. You can find me, Tyler, at Tyler_Plath. You can find Lucas at Lucas Wenzel, and that is pencil, but instead of pencil, it is WENCL. You can find Cameron at Camlaw317. And for the fellas, you can find us on Twitter also, the Fantasy Football Fellas at FF Fellas. You can find us on Instagram at the FF Fellas. You can find us at the Fantasy Football Fellas on TikTok, YouTube. Let's see what else. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, anywhere that you get your podcasts, you can find us there. So, Fantasy Football Fellas on those platforms. And hey, if you're watching on YouTube, hello, good to see you. Drop in the comments, just say hello. So, if you're not subscribed to YouTube, go ahead and go subscribe over there. Go ahead, just drop a subscribe for us. You will see all of our posts. You will see all of our shorts, all of our updated podcasts and stuff. You will see all that over on YouTube. So, last plug, and I know this is a very subtle plug, not really, but if you're looking for a place full of league winners where you want to become a league winner, join the Fantasy Football Fellas Chalkboard page. Absolutely free. You get insights, you get advice, you get trade advice, you get fantasy football waiver wire ideas, player props. You get all sorts of bonus goodies to help you win your league. You get weekly rankings as well. That's the big one. Those should be coming out today as you, the listener, are listening to this. So go ahead and join the Chalkboard. It is completely free to use. And again, you're looking to become a league winner, this is the place to be. Come join the Chalkboard page. So, all right, we got a full show. We are previewing week 9. We are officially getting to the midway point of the season. We just had the trade deadline pass us on Tuesday. So we'll go into some of those trades and the news and notes. And because there were so many deals on trade deadline day, we're going to kind of bypass the usual buy low, sell high segment and go over these deals because, like I said, it was a historic day for deals. There were so many deals, and yet there were still so many players that didn't get traded just because everyone expected them to be traded, but they just didn't get moved. So, News and Notes is brought to you by our friends over at Sleeper. Sleeper is the number one fantasy platform in the world with over 4 million users. That's where the fellas do all of our leagues over on. And I know that Lucas referenced on Tuesday's episode that that's where Cam kind of dominates. This is the facts. I can confirm. So, again, join the number one fantasy platform in the world. Sleeper is growing, and Sleeper is awesome. It is the insider's tool for fantasy football. Join Sleeper. You can check them out with a link in the description of this video. Thank you, Sleeper. We appreciate it. So, let's go into trade deadline deals and moves that were made. I'll just quickly reference the defensive players that got moved. Those don't really have any fantasy implications as far as I'm concerned. But Bradley Chubb going to Miami, Will Jackson going to Pittsburgh, Jacob Martin going from the Jets to the Broncos, and I'm probably missing one or two other defensive players that got moved, but those are the bigger ones. Obviously, Nick Chubb getting traded for a first, Will Jackson going from a not-so-great scheme fit in Washington, apparently, to now a reunion with his former DB coach of Washington, not in Washington, in Cincinnati, who is now the DB's coach in Pittsburgh. So we could see a bit of a resurgence with Will Jackson. Now on to the offensive players, the players that we care about the most because of fantasy football reasons. And in no particular order, we're just going to go through them. So starting with the Nyheim Hines deal, where Buffalo is sending Zach Moss and a conditional 6 that can turn into a 5th rounder for Nyheim Hines. I thought this deal was very, very surprising. You had guys like Kareem Hunt available, but you settle on Nyheim Hines. I don't understand it. I know that Hines he's a very explosive player and he's a pretty dynamic player, but it's hard to reason why Nyheim Hines was the choice. And if it was because of draft capital that they could get him for, I guess, but at the same time, if you have Super Bowl ambitions, go pay up, right? The report came out that the Browns wanted a 4th for Kareem Hunt. I'm sorry, if you're the Buffalo Bills, why are you not paying that 4th round pick? And maybe it was because they didn't have a 4th, but still, if you're going with Zach Moss in a 6th, at least try to entice the Browns in with Zach Moss in a 5th, right? Like, that one was one of the more stranger ones. And, as I'm saying this, Nyheim Hines is probably going to pop off now just because I've exuded some sort of pessimism about the deal. But let's go over fantasy implications for both teams that were involved in this deal. So for Buffalo, we'll start at the running backs. This is pretty much a stock down on James Cook. I would be surprised if we see, a whole lot. When I say this, James Cook hasn't played a whole lot already this year, but I would be surprised if we continue to see as much James Cook as we have been. You're kind of stocking down-ish on Devin Singletary. I feel like Singletary is still going to be the lead back, but maybe the pass catching kind of goes down. But the pass catching has just been so fluctuant with these Bills running back. So I can't really say, definitively it is a stock down, and I can't really say it's a stock up either. So it's kind of like maybe the best way to put it, it's just a neutral. Devin Singletary is still the lead back in this backfield. For the Colts, though, you are stocking up on Deion Jackson, especially with Jonathan Taylor's ankle injury bothering him again, and I'll talk about that later in a second. You're stocking up on Deion Jackson because now he's the number 2 guy. And maybe Zach Moss is a name to just kind of watch. Who knows what happens in Indy with Zach Moss? Maybe he kind of it's a rejuvenant move for his career. Who knows? Next big move that we want to talk about. Jacksonville went out and traded for Calvin Ridley. And probably one of the more shocking and one of the more stranger moves of the day, just because, again, Calvin Ridley can't play this year. And the Jaguars gave up a 5th this year and a pick next year that has so many different conditions to it that at the max, this deal can be a 5th this year and a 2nd next year. I guess why not? When you think about it, the the probability that these kind of draft picks land, are hits for teams, it's pretty slim. So you're trading those for Calvin Ridley, but at the same time, if Calvin Ridley doesn't play, then I don't know. It doesn't look like a super great trade then. So there's no really fancy implications for this year. Just again because Ridley's not playing, but for Dynasty, Christian Kirk takes a hit. Zay Jones takes a hit. Evan Ingram, who has been kind of a under the radar guy so far the last 4 or 5 weeks maybe, stock down on him, and I know he's on a 1 year, but still. For the Falcons, though, Drake London stock up. Kyle Pitts, I guess stock up. I guess. There's still the scheme fit concerns, but there's no competition. There's less competition for targets now with no Calvin Ridley in the picture for next year. So, all right, next trade we'll get into. Jeff Wilson got traded to the Miami Dolphins. And this move came after the Bradley Chubb trade because Chase Edmonds went back to Denver. I'll talk about that just after Jeff Wilson. But so Jeff Wilson's now the clear backup for Raheem Mostert, and Elijah Mitchell now for the Niners is a clear backup for Christian McCaffrey. There's not much value in really any of the guys that I mentioned besides Chase Edmonds, and this is where I get into Chase Edmonds. He's the pass catching back in this offense now, with no Mike Boone, no Javonte Williams. Chase Edmonds is going to be the guy catching passes out of the backfield. So there's some PPR upside, if you want to call it that. I think Chase Edmonds is a stash just to see how this backfield looks. And by the sounds of it, it's kind of like a three-headed monster look. But at the same time, if you're in PPR, Chase Edmonds has much more of an opportunity to score more points week to week than a Melvin Gordon and Latavius Murray just based on carries. Next big move we got is the Chicago Bears going out and getting Chase Claypool for a second-round pick this year. While I understand the trade, I don't agree with the trade just because this second-round pick going back to Pittsburgh is Chicago's pick, and this should be an early second. But at the same time, I get Chicago trying to, it feels like Chicago is just kind of betting on the future, betting on the upside with Chase Claypool, just being the bigger target for Justin Fields, being a guy that can go up and pinpoint a ball when Justin Fields just needs to get a ball out to someone. So fantasy implications, we're stocking up on Fields. He's been the quarterback 2 over the last 4 weeks with his rushing upside, and now he's getting a new weapon. But on the Pittsburgh side of things, you're stocking up on George Pickens. You're stocking up on Deontay Johnson, who's already been up. He's 3rd in targets in the league currently, if I'm not mistaken. Those just have not really translated into receptions and yards and stuff. But you're stocking up on Deontay even more, and you're stocking up on Pat Freiermuth, who has been one of the better surprises of the year so far at the tight end position. So it's really a stock up for anyone. Maybe the only player that's not really a stock up for is Darnell Mooney, just because there's another wide receiver. But at the same time, there really wasn't a whole lot going to Darnell Mooney in the first place. So maybe this is really even a stock up just because it's attention being taken away from Darnell Mooney. But really, I think, again, when it's this, and I use air quotes on this inconclusive about whether it's a stock up or stock down usually means it's a neutral. Mooney is still a very talented young wide receiver. Next big trade we got is the Minnesota Vikings making an interdivisional trade with the Detroit Lions for TJ Hawkinson. There's a lot of picks involved in this deal. I'm pretty sure it was a second-round pick this year, third-round pick next year going to Detroit, but Minnesota getting a 4th this year and a 4th next year, along with TJ Hawkinson. So you add up the kind of values of draft picks and stuff, and essentially it comes out to about a 3rd-round pick. So Minnesota getting TJ Hawkinson for the total value of a 3rd-round pick this year, some pretty savvy business by Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah, if you ask me, and that's not biased at all, coming from a Vikings fan and whatnot. But again, fantasy implications, you're stocking up on Josh Reynolds. He's now the number 2 guy on the outside, just because we haven't seen Jameson Williams yet. Jameson Williams does become an intriguing stash, but we can't really expect a whole lot from Jameson Williams because he's been injured this entire year, and even before the season began, right in mini camps, training camp, Jameson Williams is hurt, and it takes a while for a rookie to get used to the speed, get used to the playbook, build chemistry with a quarterback, all that kind of stuff. Excuse me. So, again, Jameson is a stash, but if you're looking for someone to stock up on, obviously Amon-Ra St. Brown, but also Josh Reynolds. For the Vikings, you're kind of stocking downish on mainly KJ Osborne. Maybe Thielen takes a hit or two. But the best thing about this trade for the Vikings, Irv Smith went on IR for about 2 months. So this is just kind of a easy, replacement. I shouldn't say replacement because TJ Hawkinson is miles better than Irv Smith, but um, the Vikings don't, need to scour free agency or anything like that for a replacement for Irv Smith. So I think I can see why the Lions made this trade, but I think the biggest question is like, why was he within division? That's the craziest thing. You face this guy twice a year now going forward. So again, I get why Detroit did it. From a football perspective, I don't get why it was Minnesota, but as a Vikings fan, I love this trade. TJ Hawkinson is still 25 years old. He's still getting better. This is, again, like I said, this is a savvy piece of business by Kwesi Adofo-Mensah. I'll highlight a couple of guys that didn't get traded that everyone seemed to expect or seemed and thought that they were going to get traded. Brandon Cooks, Kareem Hunt, Elijah Moore, Cam Akers. And there was a couple others too, but those were the four big names I think a lot of people expected to be moved on trade deadline day. They didn't. None of them got moved. Brandon Cooks has kind of voiced his frustration over on the social medias about his experience with the trade deadline. He's not happy with Houston. Apparently, the Browns didn't get the fourth that they were wanting for Kareem Hunt, which I explained with Buffalo. I don't know why Buffalo didn't make that move, but beats me. Elijah Moore, I'm going to personally say I didn't really think Elijah Moore was going to get moved just because it is a second-year wide receiver. And I know that Chase Claypool just got moved, but again, like the Jets made it clear right away we're not moving Elijah Moore. And I don't know. I think it was more of people's desires and dreams to see Elijah Moore move to their team more than it was realistic of Elijah Moore to get moved. And I think the same thing then goes for DJ Moore. I forgot to mention him in this list. But I think a lot of people were saying like, well, why doesn't Carolina move on from DJ Moore? They sold everyone else. Because it's public knowledge that Carolina looks at Brian Burns and DJ Moore as building pieces for the future. And then Cam Akers, this is a complete mess. Let's say, LA saying, you know what, we'll figure something out, get you, potentially out of here. Then they don't trade Cam Akers, and now they're talking with Akers' agent to get him back on the field. It's a whole mess. The Rams are just a mess in general. I mean, they got blasted by San Francisco last week. I don't think Cam Akers. It's again, there are bigger problems going on with the Rams right now than Cam Akers, but still shocking regardless that he wasn't moved. So those were all of the trade deadline deals and and thoughts that I had, especially about guys that didn't get moved. And we'll quickly go through the news and notes that we caught today as I'm recording this on Wednesday, November 2nd. First, and probably the biggest news of the day, Dan Snyder, owner of the Washington Commanders, hired Bank of America to prepare the sale of the Washington Commanders. And it's not really clear the exact details of what that sale would look like. I've seen people say it's like the minority stakes. I've seen people say like, no, it's a whole thing. Time will tell. Time will tell what it is. But the reason why that's such big news is because that came out earlier today. Later in the day, though, there was a report that came out from ESPN saying that the U.S. Attorney's Office is investigating the Commanders for alleged financial improprieties. That's big news. That is massive news, and not just and really, there's no way to really predict the fantasy implications of this investigation. Because, to be completely honest, there shouldn't be really any any implications from this investigation that affects any fantasy outlooks. That being said, though, it's just big. It's big NFL news. So pay attention to that. That's going to be a fun saga. Cooper Kupp didn't practice today, but he did participate in morning walkthroughs. And I even saw something that said that Sean McVay expects Cooper Kupp to go. And I think that's the expectation as well. I think Cooper Kupp is still good to go for Sunday, but it's just going to be something to monitor throughout the week up until Sunday. DeAndre Swift did not practice due to ankle and shoulder injuries. This is just sad. The man has just not been 100% all year, and he still continues to play, and he's still putting up like decent performances, but because of his health and stuff I'm not going to say the main reason, but part of the reason why we've seen the Jamal Williams emergence this year. And Jamal Williams is kind of taking the goal line carries, and I mean, Jamal Williams has 8 touchdowns this year. He has 8 touchdowns. So you can't help but think, like, why isn't DeAndre Swift getting those? And it's really because he's not 100% healthy. And that just stinks because the man had so much potential going into this year. He was a popular choice amongst the fellas to be one of the top contenders for the running back 1 overall spots at the end of the year. And he just can't stay 100% healthy. For Thursday Night Football, and this is, immediate news, really, because when you're listening to this is going to be before Thursday Night Football. The Texans have ruled out Nico Collins, and Brandon Cooks is questionable. I would be shocked if Brandon Cooks plays just based on the week that he's had. So going into Thursday Night Football, the Texans quite literally have no weapons on the outside. I mean, they've got players, but they're not Brandon Cooks and Nico Collins starters. So I'll get into it when we break down the games and the slate of games, but Houston, man, is just it's not pretty. That's what I'm trying to say. Next piece of news, Jonathan Taylor did not practice due to an ankle injury, and it's an ankle sprain. Something to pay attention to. But there's no more Nyheim Hines, as we talked about earlier. So in my opinion, Deion Jackson is worth a stash. Go out and get him if you can. Keep him on the bench because if Jonathan Taylor can't go, it is Deion Jackson time again. So next piece of news, Broncos GM George Payton claims that Melvin Gordon is still the running back despite getting out-carried by Latavius Murray and the team getting Chase Edmonds. I saw something earlier. I saw something that said that the early downs are going to be split between Melvin Gordon and Latavius Murray. Chase Edmonds is going to be the third down back, which usually means receiving back. And that's where I get the PPR upside for Chase Edmonds moving forward. But I don't really know what to think about the GM coming out and saying that Gordon's still the starting running back. I mean, the GM doesn't make the starting lineup every week. So I don't really know. I don't think either running backs, I don't think any of the running backs are playable this week, which is great because they're on a bye. If I'm not mistaken, Denver's on a bye, and I'm pretty sure they are. But Denver needs this bye week to figure some things out. And one of those things is the backfield. Keenan Allen said that his hamstring injury got worse over the bye week, and guess what? That's because you tried to push it and play the week before your bye week. Whose fault is that? We all know that the training staff for the Chargers have been relatively sus. They punctured Tyrod Taylor's lung. They then there's probably been some more in between, but Keenan Allen is just the next one in this long list of just what? It was even a shock to me when he went the week before their bye, just because I was like, why? There's no point. There's no point. And now guess what? He's dealing with the consequences of it now. Because of this news, I would go pick up DeAndre Carter. Also, if you are looking for kind of deeper waiver ads and stash him as well, because if Keenan Allen doesn't go, Joshua Palmer is the wide receiver 1 then on Sunday, and DeAndre Carter finds himself as a wide receiver 2. Jahan Dotson did not practice again with a hamstring issue. Jahan Dotson is pretty much non-playable anymore, and he's injured. He's been injured for a lot longer than people anticipated. When he first got injured, it sounded like it was going to be a week or 2, and now we're going on 3 or 4 weeks. That's an issue. James Conner was limited in practice for Arizona. Darrell Williams did not practice with a hip injury, and I believe that's a new injury for Darrell Williams. But James Conner being limited, sounds like he's going to be back for Sunday, because it seemed like he was going to be back for last week's game against Minnesota, but he was ruled out. So if James Conner plays, I don't know what to think of Eno Benjamin then. I don't think you can play Eno Benjamin then. But Darrell Williams picking up a new injury that should all but confirm Eno Benjamin as the RB2 moving forward for the Cardinals. And last piece of news then, Cordarrelle Patterson returned to practice for Atlanta on Wednesday. So if anything, we could see one last game of usage out of guys like Caleb Huntley. But after this week, then it's going to be back to the Cordarrelle Patterson show with a sprinkle of Algier every now and then. So that's our news and notes. Again, brought to you by our friends over at Sleeper, the #1 fantasy platform in the world. You want to check them out? You can check them out with a link in the description of this video. Again, we use Sleeper for everything. We can't express how much we love Sleeper enough. So, all right, let's get into Week 9 games. We're going to start off with a Thursday night football game between the Eagles and the Texans. Philadelphia is favored by 13.5. And honestly, Philadelphia might win by like 20. Again, there's potentially no notable weapons on the outside for the Texans, right? With Chase, or sorry, why do I keep saying Chase? Brandon Cooks is questionable. Nico Collins is already ruled out. So the expectations for Dameon Pierce, in my opinion, got to go down, because that's the only threat that the Texans have left then. On the other side of the ball, though, Philly starters, they're, again, their usual place. Houston's also is allowing the most fantasy points of running backs, so that is worth noting. So if you're a Miles Sanders manager, you should be feeling pretty excited about Thursday Night Football. That being said, I'm going Philly in this one. It's not even going to be close. Moving on to the Sunday slate of games, where we're going to start with the noon games. Obviously, got to start with Minnesota, because our Vikings fan. Okay, Minnesota's traveling to Washington, and Minnesota is favored by 3.5. This is going to be a very interesting game. Washington is kind of hitting a groove now with Taylor Heineke under center. Both teams don't really allow many fantasy points to running backs. Over the last 2 weeks, Minnesota has allowed the lowest and the fewest amount of points to running backs, and Washington has allowed the third fewest to running backs. So it seems like with Minnesota, it doesn't really care. They don't really care who you are. They're still going to run the ball. Washington has gotten into this kind of split backfield now with Antonio Gibson and Brian Robinson, and I don't know. You still start Dalvin Cook like usual. You're probably expecting like flex play out of Antonio Gibson or Brian Robinson at this point, because Robinson could find the end zone potentially. I'm not going to say it's going to happen, but potentially. Here's some of the other things you got to know about this game. Though Minnesota is allowing the third most fantasy points to quarterbacks over the last 2 weeks, and they're allowing the 5th most over the last 4 weeks. So that plays pretty well into Taylor Heineke's hands. But again, it's Taylor Heineke, so take that as you will. But then for Washington, they're allowing the 10th most fantasy points to wide receivers, but they've relatively shorted up lately. And like I said, this is going to be a very interesting game because you don't know what you're going to get from Washington just yet. Minnesota hasn't really put together a complete game just yet, but what a week it would be. It's kind of Kirk revenge game also. So, this could be the week that Minnesota finally puts together their big game and stuff because that would be awesome. Next game we'll go through. We got the LA Chargers going to Atlanta, and the Chargers are favored by 3 points. I think this is an upset alert, and it's not really going to be an upset just because when you look at the status of the Chargers, they are so beat up. They are so beat up. Defense isn't playing well, but that's because they've got some big injuries. Offense hasn't played well either recently, besides Austin Eckler. Now you lost Mike Williams. Keenan Allen may be out again. So, again, it's going to sound like it's an upset because Atlanta should not be beating the Chargers. At the same time, Atlanta has been pretty good at home. The Chargers are allowing the second most fantasy points of running backs on the season. And as I mentioned, they've got their offense is just so depleted. It's so depleted, and the way to beat the Falcons is through the air. So maybe big games from Gerald Everett and Josh Palmer, DeAndre Carter, maybe. But again, you're going to expect the big game out of Austin Eckler because again, he's like the one star player besides Justin Herbert that they still got. For Atlanta, they're allowing the most fantasy points to quarterbacks and wide receivers the last 2 weeks. And on the season, they're allowing the most points to wide receivers, 4th most points to quarterbacks. Again, should play well for the Chargers, but again, the Chargers are so depleted that it's not going to be the boom game that you would anticipate it to be. Kyle Pitts did finish as a tight end 3 last week, but I'm not sure if that's going to be sustainable. Chargers got a guy like by the name of Derwin James. So it's going to be a little bit tough for Kyle Pitts to at least replicate what he did last week, but he could still put up a relatively decent finish on the week. And like I said, I think that game is an upset alert, and I am going to go Atlanta. If I did say, I think Minnesota beats Washington. Obviously, I'm biased. Next game we got is Miami going to Chicago. Miami is favored by 5 points. Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill are one of the best duos in the NFL, if not the best. They just are dynamic. They are quick. They do everything for that offense. Miami, though, is allowing the 8th most fantasy points to wide receivers and 7th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. But they did just get Bradley Chubb, so maybe they get more of a pass rush going, so that can kind of affect the quarterbacks and therefore the wide receivers as well. But Miami does leak points and they leak yards. So this is not I don't think it's going to be as big of a blowout as people may think it is going to be, but that's, again, just what I think. Chicago is allowing the 8th most fantasy points to running back, so this could be a decent Raheem Mostert week. But I think the thing that needs to be talked about with Chicago is just how similar Khalil Herbert and David Montgomery are, and how similar they are, again, to Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard. They just are. Montgomery is still getting the bulk of carries, has not really been super efficient with his carries. Just like Ezekiel Elliott, Tony Pollard has been the more efficient running back, not getting as many snaps and carries, just like Khalil Herbert. And Khalil Herbert has been the more efficient back in Chicago, which makes it very tough to play either one. Even though Montgomery is still averaging more than double Herbert snaps the last 4 weeks on average, like you take the average over the last 4 weeks, Montgomery is still getting double the carries and the snaps. I shouldn't say carries, the snaps. The snaps for sure. I don't know about the carries, but the snaps for sure. Even though that's the case, you can't put your complete trust and faith in David Montgomery. He's just not been efficient, and he's not been as efficient as you had hoped him to be this year. So I think Miami wins that one pretty comfortably, but it's not going to be, again, like I said, it's not going to be the blowout that a lot of people would expect this to be. Next game we got is Carolina traveling to Cincinnati. Cincinnati's favored by 7. Carolina's finding a groove. They are finding a groove. Deontay Foreman, I'm not going to say it. But he looks good. DJ Moore is finally getting going with PJ Walker under center. They're kind of they're finding a groove a little bit. But they've got a very tough matchup going to Cincinnati, and everyone knows how good Cincinnati is at home. The thing to note about Cincinnati, though, is that this offense looks very, very different without Jamar Chase. So I'm expecting a bit of a bounce back from what we saw on Monday Night Football against Cleveland from Cincinnati. But at the same time, if Cincinnati kind of comes in kind of sleepy, kind of like, well, it's Carolina. Carolina might give them a game. So, again, for Carolina, you got to start Deontay Foreman, got to start DJ Moore. That's really about it. Cincinnati has been relatively tough on defense so far this year. So you can't expect crazy numbers from either of those guys, but they're still the two biggest playmakers on that offense. For Cincinnati, you're still playing everyone. Burrow, Mixon, Higgins, Tyler Boyd, Hayden Hurst, you name it, they should all be in your lineup. I do think Cincinnati wins that game. And when I say it's going to be close, I think it's going to be like 6 or 7, which is right where the spread is at. So Vegas knows something. Next game we got is Detroit. Sorry, Detroit hosting Green Bay. We all know about Detroit and their defense and how not great it is. We all know about Green Bay and their offense and how not great their offense is. So this is really going to be a matchup of which offense can make more plays. That, to me, sounds like a great offensive game. But it's a divisional game. Green Bay did just kind of improve a little bit on defense. I mean, they held Buffalo for how bad Green Bay has been. They held Buffalo fairly well. I think a lot of people expected that game to be not much of a contest, but Green Bay showed some fight and they made it interesting. So Green Bay is favored by 3.5 in this game. I don't know how to feel about it because it's at Detroit. Detroit usually gives Green Bay a run for their money. I'll go Detroit on an upset on this one. Again, I'm biased. I'm a Vikings fan. Next game we got is Indianapolis traveling to New England, and New England being the favorite with 5.5 points. This is going to be a yikes game for Indianapolis if there's no Jonathan Taylor, because now you're throwing Sam Ehlinger against Bill Belichick. I don't think I need to explain much else. That's not ideal. The Patriots offense isn't super great either, besides Ramondre Stevenson and Jacoby Myers. I will admit my fault. I didn't think Jacoby Myers was going to have a great week going up against the Jets last week, who have not allowed many points to wide receivers all year with Sauce Gardner, DJ Reed. Myers found the end zone and he got some steady volume. I will throw my hands up and admit I was wrong on that one. I did not think that was going to happen. Even though the Patriots offense isn't that great, I think they can still put up points on Indianapolis's defense just because Indy has just kind of been borderline shambles. Both defenses don't really give up many fantasy points, but Indy does allow the 12th most fantasy points to running back, so there's hope for Ramondre. Here's the other thing. Stephon Gilmore is going back to New England for the first time, so that'll be interesting to watch, and especially if he kind of takes on Jacoby Myers. That'll be interesting. I think New England wins that one pretty comfortably, But I do think it's going to be one of the more uglier games of the week, just because both teams have just not hit a stride just yet. We got 2 more noon games, then we get into the afternoon slate of games. The second to last noon game, we got Buffalo traveling to the Meadowlands to take on the Jets. Buffalo is favored by 12.5. The one matchup I'm most looking forward to in this game is Sauce Gardner versus Stephon Diggs. You best believe I'm going to have my bowl of popcorn watching NFL Red Zone because I won't be able to get the Bills-Jets game in my market, but I will be checking it whenever I can because that's going to be a good one. I think Buffalo does win this one pretty handily, though. Just the Jets' offense just looks lost without Breece Hall. It just does not look the same. And I know that losing Breece Hall is a big loss, but you still got really talented players on your team. You got Garrett Wilson, who kind of popped off against New England. You've got Elijah Moore still, but Elijah Moore is Elijah Moore for those reasons, right? Corey Davis potentially back. He's still a little bit injured. But you got Michael Carter and you traded for James Robinson. Like you've got talent on the offense. So why is so much change with no Breece Hall? Couldn't tell you. That's why I'm not paid like a scout or an NFL coach, because I cannot tell you why. Last game of the noon slate, when I say noon again, Central Time. We have Vegas taking on Jacksonville at Jacksonville. Vegas is 1.5 point favorites. I know Jacksonville's kind of been on a cold streak and an inconsistent streak recently, but Vegas has also. Okay? Did not start out great, and then they kind of hit their stride because Josh Jacobs kind of took over. And look what happened. They got shut out by New Orleans, and New Orleans has not been great. Jacksonville is allowing the 6th most fantasy points to running back, so maybe this is a bounce-back week for Josh Jacobs. But for Vegas, so they are allowing the most fantasy points to quarterbacks, the 3rd most to running backs, and the 3rd most to tight ends. This defense stinks. Just stinks. And I'm not going to pinpoint the reasons for the defense not playing well and the team in general not playing well on this one issue, but it needs to be brought up and talked about why Mac Hollins is outsnapping Davante Adams. And it's happened the past 2 weeks. Mac Hollins has outsnapped Davante Adams. Why? I don't care if Mac Hollins is a scheme fit, okay? You brought in Josh McDaniels. You brought in Davante Adams. Get your coach to figure out a way to get Davante Adams on the field more often and more involved in this offense. Because Lucas had said it best, Davante Adams is looking more like a Mike Williams this year than he was a Stephon Diggs or a Justin Jefferson of years past. That's the crazy thing to me. Davante Adams has just not been the same Davante Adams. And I get it. It's not, again, this is going from Aaron Rodgers to Derek Carr. You're going from Matt LaFleur, who's one of the better play callers in the league, except for maybe this year, to Josh McDaniels. Like, I get that there's going to be a transition thing. But why? Why is Davante Adams just not like the number one option in this offense? That's the craziest thing to me. So, I don't really know what to think of this game. I feel bad if you're a Vegas fan. I feel bad if you're a Jaguars fan because I don't think many people outside of these two teams are very interested in this game. Sorry, I'm just going to be honest. I'm going to take Jacksonville on an upset in that one, by the way. Vegas is not great. They are just not great. All right, moving on to the afternoon slate of games, starting it off with Seattle traveling to Arizona, and Arizona 2-point favorites in that one. Arizona's allowing the 6th most fantasy points to quarterbacks and the most fantasy points to tight ends. Seattle, on the other hand, is allowing the 9th most fantasy points to running backs and the 2nd most fantasy points to tight ends. So, big Zach Ertz game on the way, but at the same time, DeAndre Hopkins has been in fuego since coming back. You can't. Arizona's offense is evolving to feed DeAndre Hopkins no matter what, to get Rondale Moore in space, to hit Zach Ertz over the middle. That's the offense. And then if you get James Conner back, that'll help. Seattle, though, Seattle's been hot. What hasn't been hot, honestly, Arizona's defense. Arizona's defense can get after the quarterback a little bit. They can stop the run a little bit. But they can leak yards and they can leak points. Hence 34 points to Minnesota last week. That'll be an interesting game, and I find that game more intriguing than what I believe is going to be called the game of the week because it's the Rams going to Tampa Bay. But I find Seattle and Arizona more intriguing than the Rams and Bucks, if I'm going to be honest. That sounds crazy. You could not have paid me to say that at the beginning of the season, but here we are. Rams and Bucks next I'll dive into. Tampa's favored by 3 in this game, and I guess I get it, but at the same time, Tampa's just not been good. Rams have not been good, but Tampa's been worse. So maybe the Rams go in and steal one, but again, this is the what could have been game, right? Because when they were making the schedule earlier this year, someone was clamoring for, hey, we should get this game. Game of the week, Brady's last go of things, against the former Super Bowl champs. This will be a great game. And that's just not how the season has gone so far. Both defenses just don't really allow fantasy points in general. Both are really stingy on the run. They can give up big plays through the air, but not often. So like I said, I take the Rams in the upset, but I'm not sure what to fully expect from this game because there's a lot left to be desired between both teams. All right, on to the Sunday Night Football game now. We've got Tennessee taking on Kansas City. Kansas City is favored by 12.5 points, and that is outrageous to me. That they have a Sunday Night Football game where the favored team is double-digit point favorites. And when I say I can't believe it, I'm just looking at the spread. I think the spread is deserved. It sounds strange putting double-digit spread favorites in a Sunday Night Football game, in a primetime game. That's just me. Tennessee's allowing the 10th most fantasy points to quarterback, 6th most to wide receivers, 10th most to tight ends. You know what that means? They are susceptible in the air. You know who likes to move the ball through the air? Kansas City Chiefs. That being said, though, Kansas City is allowing the 3rd most fantasy points to quarterbacks, the 7th most to running backs, 3rd most to wide receivers, 7th most to tight ends. Kansas City's defense doesn't really stop anyone either. But when Tennessee is solely reliant on Derrick Henry, that takes up time of possession, so maybe they can keep Kansas City's offense off the field. That's just never how it works. Give me Kansas City in that game. But again, Derrick Henry, you're starting him. Robert Woods, you start him. Kansas City, we've talked about Juju Smith-Schuster becoming a more reliable option now. You're starting him. Can't really start any running back because Tennessee is actually fairly good against the rush. Travis Kelce, you're playing. Kadarius Toney is going to be someone interesting to watch as we get closer and closer to Sunday. I don't know if he gets a full workload, but who knows? He can make an instant impact. Who knows? Again, just pay attention, monitor his status and whatnot. Last game of Week 9, Monday Night Football, we got the Ravens taking on the Saints. The Ravens are favored by 2.5 going to New Orleans. And what we saw from New Orleans against Vegas, there may be reason to believe that New Orleans is on their way back. But Baltimore is a fairly solid team. First in the AFC East. I don't know. They find ways to win. Baltimore's allowing the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks and the 4th most to wide receivers. So Chris Olave could have a game. Andy Dalton may be a sneaky streaming option, a sneaky one. But that sounds weird to me. There's probably better options out there. But if you're desperate, Andy Dalton may be your one. If Jameis Winston doesn't play, New Orleans on the other side, they're allowing the ninth most fantasy points to wide receivers, which kind of plays that does not help Baltimore a whole lot. Rashad Bateman's going to be out for a couple weeks. So Mark Andrews possibly, but monitor his status with his shoulder injury. And New Orleans has been pretty decent against the run. That's going to be a very interesting Monday Night Football game. Here's the over-under total is 48 points. I think that hits the under. I honestly do. I don't think many points are going to be put up in that game. I'm going to take New Orleans in the upset on that one too. So that finishes up, and that will wrap up the Week 9 preview. I'll run through the games here real quick with my winners and in my predictions. I'm predicting Philly over Houston, Minnesota over Washington, Atlanta beating the Chargers, Miami going to Chicago and winning, Cincinnati handling business, Detroit in an upset against Green Bay, New England over Indianapolis, the Bills over the Jets, the Jaguars over the Raiders. Yep, that's right. Yep, I said Jaguars over the Raiders. I'm going to take the Cardinals over the Seahawks. I'm going to take the Rams over the Bucks, Chiefs over the Titans, and on Monday Night Football, give me the Saints over the Ravens. So with that, again, that'll wrap up our Week 9 preview episode of the Fantasy Football Fellas. Or I should say with Fantasy Football Fellas. You know what I mean. Again, you can find us on all social medias. You can find us on Twitter at FFFellas. Find us on Instagram at the FFFellas. Fantasy Football Fellas on TikTok, YouTube, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, anywhere you get your podcasts, Fantasy Football Fellas. You find us there. Join our Chalkboard page. If you are trying to get an edge over your league mates and want to become a league winner, the Fantasy Football Fellas Chalkboard page is the place to go. You just go to the App Store, you type in Chalkboard app, it'll show up for you. Then you can join as many communities as you want. Join the fellas, though. That's the best one. Not biased at all. Join the Chalkboard, become a league winner with so many perks, weekly rankings, trade advice, starts and sits, all that kind of stuff, and even more over on our Chalkboard page. Completely free to join. I think we've got about 1,700. Let me confirm. How many people do we got? We're getting closer. We're getting close to about 1,600. We're getting close to 1,600 members over on our Chalkboard page. Go join it. Become a league winner. You can find me on Twitter, Tyler_Plath. You can find Lucas on Twitter at Lucas Wenzel. You can find Cameron on Twitter at Camlaw317. I already gave you all the plugs for our handles. So with that, we will be back for Stardom Situm Saturday to recap any final injury updates, give you our start sits of the week. Well, it will also give you some player prop plays courtesy of our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. So stay tuned. You don't want to miss that episode. That'll be coming out on Saturday. So for me, Ty, the one fella that flew solo tonight, on behalf of the three other stooges, we're just being dudes, talking fantasy football, talking football with all of you guys. Hope you enjoyed. We'll see you on Saturday for Stardom Situm. Deuces.